Speaker make it clear.
Well, I did not make the comment.
Bill is not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Good, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with a panel of bloggers and opinion shapers. Joining me tonight, he is the editor of independent news site livenews.co.nz, commentator and journalist Selwyn Manning, and he is a social commentator, broadcaster and blogger, Efeso Collins. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, is the Glen Innes housing redevelopment for middle-class gentrification or for state tenants? Issue 2, does the gambling bill rewrite mean Auckland will remain cursed by pokies? And issue 3 tonight, does New Zealand need employment law to legalise scabs? Plus, we'll end the show with a final word, but let's kick things off tonight with issue 1. This week, Len Brown and Nick Smith met in Glen Innes to launch a draft blueprint for the redevelopment of Tamaki. The meeting wasn't advertised for fear of protests, and those in attendance were mostly property developers and political pundits with a vested interest. Locals were ignored, as the plan seems to be to gentrify Glen Innes and throw state tenants out onto the street. At the launch, Len Brown said the challenge now is to ensure new homes and economic development are delivered in a way that supports the aspirations of local residents and builds strong and resilient communities. Selwyn, how does that statement line up with the reality of forcing state tenants out onto the street?
To me, just looking at that, it suggests that there is no value in the communities that are built by state house tenants.
Yeah.
And to the evidence in the communities is to the contrary. You know, where you've got solid, stable populations of people, irrespective of whether or not they are state house tenants, market tenants, or homeowners, where you've got stable communities, you get stable and sensible kind of outcomes, meaning law and order is better, progress for the individuals better, the schools, they take a very strong central part in developing the communities. When you start to actually undermine one part of that community to the point where you're evicting them, moving them on against their will, you're destabilising that whole community. And I think Len Brown, he comes from South Auckland, which is not that far away from GI. He should have a good close look at what he's advocating there. It doesn't seem to me to be right on any level.
Is stability just something for the middle classes and the well-to-do? Is that the message they're driving here?
Well, it may be. I mean, you know, if you asked Nick Smith to explain himself, perhaps you would get a conservative, neoliberal even response relating to the economics of a long-term plan for that particular part of the region. But that, once again, is a calculation based on the fiscal or the household kind of value of each unit. There are other values in play here. And once again, I'd say that Len Brown should be aware of those values, and those are community stability, community input, and progress right through that whole part.
Some of these families were granted their state houses in part because their grandfathers had come back from the war. It was something that was given and granted them. Some of those houses are actually, some of those streets are named after the battalions that went to fight. Aren't we throwing all of that history out the window here to build nice subdivisions for property?
Well, we are, and you know, from a developer and from the National Party point of view, I think that what we can see here is they've looked and they can see Glendowie, it's worth a lot of money. Yep, Remuera, it's worth a lot of money, and they're not too far, Kohimarama, etc., etc. They're right on the border of Glen Innes, and they're thinking, I think that's what they're looking at. They're thinking these land values are ready to take off, and we're going to get in there for our developers to be able to benefit from that. But at the end of the day, yes, every family that is being evicted, that has been there for a time, deserves to have the right to live where they have lived.
So Len Brown uses housing affordability as a word a lot, but this plan will see less affordable houses as income-related rentals are replaced with market rentals. What does housing affordability mean to you?
Oh, it means that people don't have to give up 80-90% of their income to pay their rent. That's what housing affordability is about. And what we've got are people are predominantly on low incomes. We've got a lot of beneficiaries who live in Glen Innes. This is despicable. And the fact that they've come out to Tamaki or they've come out to Glen Innes to make it, isn't this wonderful? We're showing New Zealand this is the way forward. It's not. It might be the way forward for middle New Zealand. It is not the way forward for those families who are Māori and Pacific who've been staying in that area for a very long time. And Selwyn makes a really good point about building strong communities. And we've had good communities built in Glen Innes. We've got families who've been there for a very long time. They love being there, and now they're just being thrown out and said, oh, look, we'll try and find you a 3 or 4 bedroom apartment somewhere near town, and you might get a job. That provides no stability for their family. And if you know Māori and Pacific people well, you'll know that they're a family knit, close, tied family community. Taking them away from each other is going to be detrimental for the strong family ties that they've maintained and kept for a long period. So this is a really despicable move. And you're right, this is about saying, oh yeah, we're close to Glendowie, we're close to Kohimarama, let's extend it a little bit, let's let the rich white folk come in and they can look over the lovely seashore and see some lovely views, and in the meantime, we'll just find some concrete jungles that we can put these low-income families into.
Walk me through, because I need some help here. I'm trying to understand this. It makes no sense to me. I thought that Glen Innes and the state housing that we had there worked, that the stability that it provided, the very, very foundations that we want to be able to provide for those communities, had actually worked in Glen Innes. Ripping them up, throwing them to one side, where do they go? Where do those families go?
Well, we don't know. They're going to have to find market rent somewhere else, or they're going to put into the concrete jungles that that the unitary plan is talking about. But the fact that people have been throwing rubbish bins, have been protesting, have been out there picketing, is a clear indication that these are strong communities. These people have a base. This is like their home. A lot of our Pacific families came from the islands in the 1960s. We all came central Auckland and then dispersed into South and East Auckland, this pocket, I guess, of East Auckland. These families have been there for a long time. We've got strong Pacific churches in this area, and now we've already closed. I think it was Tamaki Intermediate that was closed recently, and that's probably being set up for a charter school, which is going to be very nice for the wealthy, because they're going to come along and say, oh look, these poor little dark-skinned kids, will help them out by setting up a charter school. So there isn't a lot of places for them to go. We've got such a housing shortage in Auckland that there's nothing for them to go to. We are splitting up and dividing these communities.
Warkworth isn't much of a commute, is it? Selwyn, privatising state houses for the benefit of merchant banker property developers doesn't sound like the pathway to social justice to me. Should the poor just accept that they have no right of ownership?
No, and I think when you analyse this type of thing, it is probably helpful to, when you try to place yourself in the National Party's shoes, the government's shoes here, to strip away those ideals of social justice that one may hold dear, and then try and look at the values that is driving this type of policy. And so the audience itself can kind of come to its own conclusions about that. And once again, everybody can mobilise to express the power through vote in 2014. But the problem here is, and just building on what Efeso was just saying, the community is everything for many cultures. Many in Pākehā circles would think, no, I don't have to rub shoulders with people around my immediate area. I'm quite okay as an individual. That doesn't work for everybody. And, like Efeso said at the end of what he just said there about the churches, what if they're moving a family that is affiliated to a particular church, is affiliated to a school, and they move them somewhere else? It takes years to embed into the culture and of that new community. And you're an outsider for a long time. These are hugely problematic. With Manurewa, some of the problems in Clendon and all those parts of that part of South Auckland have experienced for a good decade real social problems. Many argue, and I reported down there for some years in the 1990s, many argue that that is because the communities of Otara and Mangere were becoming stable, and one of the things like the best garden in Otara type competitions that were around, and you saw evidence of that. But those who were not stable within those communities were leaving. Perhaps it was the young ones who were having problems, and they were leaving. In Manurewa and Clendon, A lot of that migration settled in there and continues to migrate around, and there's a destabilising effect, and you see the consequences in law and order, etc. National should be mindful of that.
Efeso, in the wealthier suburbs, Len Brown can't backpedal from the unitary plan fast enough to promise local engagement. In the poorer suburbs, it's lip service. Will this hurt Len Brown in the next election?
I think it will, and I think, and up against a good candidate who people know has been in the community, like John Minto has taught at Tangaroa College. He's been in the Otara community for a long time. He's been supporting the protests that have been going on in Glen Innes when they're removing these houses. I think people are saying there is a viable alternative here to support John Minto, who has stood with the community of Glen Innes to make sure that they have a strong voice in opposing what's going on. Len is in trouble. People are going to be saying, look, we've got an alternative in John Minto. Maybe we should look away from Len and go with someone who's going to actually stand with the community.
Final question to both of you on this. We now see government threatening Christchurch with an outright takeover of planning consents. Would Nick Smith try that in Auckland?
Oh, to his folly, and to his party's folly.
Really?
You take on the size of Auckland that has only just now got a sense of mobilising against central government moves. And Nick Smith has bitten off more than he could chew. Remember, Nick Smith made a move on Auckland Council some months ago with a front-on attack. He was absolutely intimidated back into the beehive in his Nelson base.
Yeah.
He sat there, and now he's trying to do it through the legislative wing and through stealth. It won't work. They try it, and it'll be at their fault.
Would it work?
No, stealth is definitely the way for Nick Smith, but he knows now that Auckland have finally got an idea as a community what the super city's about, and they're saying to central government, you stay where you are, you do your affairs, let us determine our destiny as a city.
Auckland don't like being told what to do by Wellington.
Not at all.
Don't like it. Thank you, panel. Moving on with our second issue tonight. Te Reo Levels Reduction of Gambling Harm Private Members Bill has come back from Select Committee so watered down and gutted of any genuine worth whatsoever, one would almost suspect Sky City wrote the thing. Auckland has a real problem with pokie machines targeting poorer areas and draining the cash for posher sports clubs in other parts of town. So this response to the problem of gambling is a terrible letdown. The ability for local councils to close down pokie venues, gone. The ability for local councils to decrease pokies, gone. The ability to pump the majority of proceeds into local communities, gone. The ability to use devices that would limit the amount of gamblers, the amount that gamblers could gamble, that's gone as well. Efeso, the Māori Party's credibility on this issue, gone?
Oh, absolutely. Goodbye. And the only thing that Te Ururua Flavel got out of this was a fancy handshake that him and Chris Tremaine had when they sat down at their press conference. That was it. That was his one way to connect with the community. Oh, look at me, I can do a fancy handshake. This is absolutely disgusting. This has come back, it's a wet bus ticket, and we're trying to slap people around and say, this is going to make a real change. Look, the NZRU came out and they were saying, oh, isn't this great? We can't have all these rugby clubs closing down. They make millions for crying out loud. And then they've got the nerve to turn to these poorer communities and say, well, we've got to do our best. If you look at what when the Otago Rugby Union was in real trouble, what did they do? Get into pokies in South Auckland, because they knew that the problem gamblers are going to continue to have these challenges as long as pokies are in the community. The fact that we can't, and now they're just saying as part of this new portion of the legislation, well, instead of shutting them down, we'll just move them to wealthier areas. Gee, what a fantastic answer. That's
And
they
it's
won't
optional.
be used.
It's optional for them to move.
Yeah.
They're not going to move, are they?
No, they're not. They're going to stay where the problem gamblers are, because that's how they make money.
Flavel says this is salvaging the bill. Isn't it just the self-mutilation of the bill?
Yeah, no, I think it's...
Where's the salvage?
Yeah, well, their party won't be salvaged out of this. They're going to struggle in Ikaroa Rāwhiti. And this, people are going to say, well, what difference have they made? What difference can they make? There's this talk about, oh, it's good to be at the table. But what are they doing? Serving cups of tea at the table?
Well, and this is the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
If this is the negotiating strength of the Māori Party being at the table, what's the point of being at the table?
It's also an indication that the one person that could arguably take over the leadership, to give some sort, to inherit the legacy of what was set up in the Māori Party, has absolutely been done over with a wet flannel by a lowly ranked cabinet minister, Tremaine. You know, that is a real sad thing to observe.
So instead of 80% being returned to the local community, national might might be able to lift it to 40% from 37% in 2 years' time. Why shouldn't that investment be local? Why shouldn't that money, if you're going to take it out of that community, why can't it go back to that community?
Because it doesn't work for groups like the Otago Rugby Union, that's why. And they want to keep their rugby and all the nice middle New Zealanders happy. It should go back into the community. The fact that 100% isn't returned to the community is a surprise to me. And you know, the fact that he's come back and he said, oh look, we've had to make these concessions and eventually we might get over the 40% threshold and be able to give back to the community. Our community is suffering like crazy. We know the issues around problem gambling. The least we could do is, if they're there and if we've got the sinking lid policy in place, if they're there, let's return those funds back to the community. Let's support the community organisations that are doing good things with our young people, and let's ensure that the sinking lid policy actually is enforced.
Look, in the past, when the kind of this structure was first put out, and you had the COGS committee, the community organisation that distributed the funding, it kind of worked in some ways for those social community trusts, etc., to be able to float, to be able to stay there working. There was the Anglican Services for Women and Children in Otahu, and that was one of the beneficiaries in the 1990s of this very thing. But that was when the problem was smaller. That was prior to Sky City Casino being a big player in the region relating to feeding the gambling problems, etc., etc. So now the legislation must and should, and by right the public should expect, move to resolving, to provide solutions to contemporary problems, not try and actually restructure and bleed more out of a failed system.
How important is gambling to the National Party? And seeing as gambling is an industry that's built on misery, how politically ethical is it
it's not
rely
ethical.
on them?
It's obviously important. Sky City is obviously important. We look at, we all know, and we've seen what John Key and his people did to make sure Sky City was happy and able to progress and increase the number of pokies on site. Even change laws to allow it to happen. What it's trying to do with this sinking lid policy is to then try and ratchet up the outgoings that are required by way of regulation for those smaller groups, the RSAs, etc. They must be thinking, what? They're going to take up more. We're not the ones that are feeding the problems in the family units here. So the whole thing is fundamentally flawed. I think what it suggests is a detachment from the realities of impact of such policies. So therefore, when you are detached from the realities of the problem, you're not going to get a solution that's going to meet that need.
Final question to both of you. Speaking about Sky City, should David Shearer and his friends, his fellow MPs, should they have gone to the corporate box?
No, they should not have been there. It just, politics is about perception. The fact that they're sitting there after everything, they've dogged Sky City on this casino stuff, and then they go in there and they watch a rugby game, and then one of the MPs says, well, actually, I was there because I wanted to express some dissatisfaction. Well, goodness me, go have coffee with the person rather than sit there. And how much dissatisfaction can you say to someone when you're watching an 80-minute rugby game?
And popping food and drinking, and having...
That was Phil Goff. I think he was absolutely caught out on that comment, and I think, they were thinking he knew he was on a hiding to nowhere with it.
Where was the nous? Where was the management of that? Surely after creating all of that political capital, righteously critiquing that convention centre for Pokies deal, what happened?
What this suggests to me is the electorates are very sensitive to any perception of one cronyism, because National's been milking cronyism for the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. So if Labor gets into any court where it looks like it's got a hint of it, it is so damaging. The problem for the electorates, particularly in the big electorates that are traditionally gone for Labor, they're thinking, well, where do we voice our concern on these things? At least Labor fronted on it. You do not see the National Party MPs fronting on such things.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3 tonight, Jamie Lee Ross's legislation of scab Labor private members bill has been pulled from the ballot. What are the ramifications? Efeso, if Ports of Auckland could have hired scab Labor, they would have. Should workers be concerned with this?
Oh, absolutely. This is a way to take away the rights of workers. The very point you go out on a strike is because your employer is being a complete mongrel and not working fairly with you. This is about equitable outcomes for everyone concerned. And if you take away the ability for people to strike and give a clear message to their employer that they are not happy with their working conditions, that they want something better. This is all part and process of the negotiation capital that you have with your employer. By taking these rights away, and well, you're taking them away by saying you can hire scab labour. That is completely unethical, because it means that these people have got nothing to stand on. So the minute they start striking, they think, oh, don't worry about it. Then you might as well just fire the lot, because we can get cheap casual labour.
John Key consistently says he's centre right. How centre right is this?
It's as centre right as what John Key wishes to define where the centre position is.
Right.
I mean, that's a strategy in itself. It's trying to drag Labor across that line into what once would have been considered to be centre right.
This is pretty hard right, isn't it?
Well, it is. What it says to me is that National is hell-bent on creating a situation where it's no faith, good bargaining.
Right.
Good on their part with no faith.
Right.
You know, and I think what is required here probably in the medium term is, if there was a change of government in 2014, it would have to be on the legislative agenda to correct some of these wrongs right at the front end. That's what people who are concerned about these kind of things, I'm hearing, are hanging out for, a chance to see change. You're not going to change the trajectory that is currently in place. So the realities are, you're satisfied with that or not.
A question to both of you on this issue. We saw the government were quite happy to manufacture a dispute at the Hobbit and use that for political gain. Could we expect, with this now in front of Parliament, a whole range of industrial sectors being provoked into action, all sorts of issues, so that the government can point to and go, well, we do actually need this legislation? Is it going to be like
they're
that?
trying to scaremonger. If you look, in 2011, there were 12 strike actions taken. That's what the CTE have come out and said. 12 strike actions. That is not, or stop work meetings. That is not major. This is a way to entrench low wages, to take away people's voice, and like you say, Selwyn, this is going to be all good bargaining, but it's going to be no faith bargaining, or no good faith bargaining. And so I think workers are going to be challenged. Look at what they've done. They've brought in the 90-day, if we like you, and otherwise we'll kick you out. So this is not good for working class New Zealand.
And it's out of step with, I think, the contemporary view out there. If you asked 100 people, what do you think that the union's got this country in this, squeezed with its fist? They'd say, what? There isn't, like in the 70s, for example, I was at high school and everything back then, but you heard it everywhere. Oh, the unions are too strong, they're squeezing the lifeblood out of this country. You heard it from working class people in South Auckland. You don't hear that now. What this is all about is taking further control. If there was a situation where, the workers were stifling economic growth in this country, well, then you'd think, well, yeah, maybe that's what's in behind this. But they're not. People are losing their jobs because of the failure of the current economic regimes and doctrines. It's the other way round. So we need to be very clear on the motivations behind what is coming out of the beehive.
And what are those motivations?
Well, they are to squeeze as much out of the population's workforce for the benefit of those that are economically developing in the upper areas. That is National's representation bed. That's what it looks after. It's being honest about it. The challenge is in the Parliament, in the legislature, right down to the political groups in the communities, is to be true to who they represent. That Labor's challenge, for example, as the more centrist position one main party, is to be true to the people that its members in caucus, its communities, etc., to be true to them and to absolutely put down on the line what it will do should it win in 2014.
Let's wrap the show with final word. Selwyn, your final word this week is?
Well, it's a little bit, there's a lot of scuttlebutt and chatter coming out of the beehive in the Parliament at the moment relating to the Peter Dunn and the Andrea Vance issue. Now, this is several weeks ago now, but there is a little bit of chatter that's starting to suggest that Peter Dunn is the fall guy. Now, from a journalist's point of view, if you are sitting there and you've got a big scoop, you've got a breaking news story of national importance, even international importance, you're not going to rely on one source. You're going to, as much as you can, triangulate that with people from outside of bed of their own kind of areas. So you would get information perhaps from somebody inside the executive. maybe a National Party person, and you would think, oh, okay, that information's I better check the detail of this. You may go to a person in the operative side, perhaps in the GCSB. You may then check it out with your contacts that would know, but are not in perhaps the main party. And I think that's what happened to Peter Dunn.
Efeso, your final word this week?
Well, this week we celebrated a year since Advanced Pasifika, where we took to the streets of Auckland, and it's been a good time for us to reflect on what that voice might look like, what getting everyone onto the streets of Auckland was. And whilst I think there's some real concern amongst working Pasifika families around Jamie Lee Ross's bill, you think about, people saying, oh, well, let's negotiate out you having a morning tea break or a lunch break and be good for 90 days and we'll keep you on. And now the possibility that you can't have strike action. I think some of us will be sitting there in the community thinking it might be time to stand up again. It's time to say we are not going to accept this. So Advanced Pasifika is about making sure that we keep the voice going.
Thank you, Efeso. Thank you, Selwyn. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word. TV3's The Vote debated this week if parents or poverty were to blame for hungry children. With the culture of beneficiary bashing fostered by corporate mainstream media who plays to the worst of our angels for ratings, the moot that it was bad parenting to blame for child hunger was always going to produce a result that would make Mississippi pre-abolition of slavery look progressive. Blaming the parent ignores the reality of poverty. Poverty crushes the spirit. The stress of it helps make violence happen. That's not justifying the abuse, it's explaining it. Yes, there are plenty of good parents in poverty who make it, but there are also plenty who don't. Feeling superior by blaming parents only punishes those children further. Poverty is a choice, only cements those 270,000 children trapped in it and allows those who have money to be guilt-free. Apparently we can't afford $100 million per year to feed the kids, but we can afford $400 million per year on tax cuts for the rich. We should be ashamed that this is accepted without a shrug. Sadly, in the end, a TV shouting match of heat sheds no light. I love how the fate of over 250,000 kids in poverty is entertainment fodder for a gladiatorial TV debate. That is part of the problem. If the vote was around during universal suffrage, it would have revealed a similar petty bigotry. Political courage means standing up to ignorance and the worst elements of our selfishness and championing those without the economic or cultural power to defend themselves. It's called the tyranny of the majority for a reason. Ultimately, brothers and sisters, even if you want to blame the parents, it's not the fault of those children for having crap mums and dads. Their hunger and their poverty is still the responsibility of a decent, egalitarian country. I am my brother's keeper and I am my neighbour's babysitter. It takes a community to feed a kid. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded new citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand